The forms for managing users and roles are very similar to those of managing the posts and tags. In fact, you can use the post and tag forms as a basis for the user and the roles. And that's exactly what I did. I went ahead and created these forms, but all I did was modify the HTML. I haven't done anything else with the code except for commenting out some lines of code. So let's briefly go over this HTML, and then we will just start writing some code. Now, first of all, instead of calling this user.cshtml, I decided to change the terminology and use account.cshtml. The reason being because the page class has a property called user, and whenever we create the class like we have for post and tag, if we created a user class, then we would run into naming conflict issues. So in order to avoid those completely, I just decided to use the word account. So all of the fields are prefixed with account. We have account ID, which is hidden. We also have the mode, which is also hidden. We have the field for the username, account's name, then the 2 passwords, and then the email, and then the roles. Now, I didn't do anything with the grid. We will make these modifications after we are finished writing our handler and all of that other stuff. But what we need to change for the grid is going to be very, very simple, just a few lines. The form for the role is also very simple. In fact, it's more simple than the form for the tag because there's really only one field, the role name. Otherwise, we have the hidden ID field and, of course, the mode. And I also did not do anything with the grid here. So with all of that in mind, let's go to our web config file first. And let's go ahead and set up the handlers for our account handler and for the role handler. I'm just going to paste this in, but it's the same thing that we've done before. We remove the handler, and then we add the handler, specifying the name, the type, the verb, and then the path. For the account handler, that's going to be admin/account.ashx, and then the role handler is going to go to admin/role.ashx. So with our configuration done, let's close that file. And before we write our handlers, let's write the account and role classes, similar to the post and the tag classes. So let's start with post, and let's just copy and paste that file, because we can use this as a basis for the account class. So let's change the name of the class to account. I'm also going to change this comment as well, summary description for account, and we really don't need this constructor, so I'm just going to delete the constructor. Now we still need this page private property. We also need the mode, and this logic is going to work fine. Now the slug is going to be different. Instead of a slug, we have a username. So whenever we are going to do something like editing a user, the path will be admin/account/edit, and then the username. So that is what we will change slug to. And the logic is going to be fine for here as well. We want the URL data at the index of 1. Otherwise, it will be empty. So now the current property we are going to have to modify. First of all, we want to change our repository from post repository to user repository. Although, let's go ahead and let's change this to account repository just to keep everything uniform. So let's first of all change the file name from user repository to account repository. And then we will need to change the name of the class as well. So account repository. And we also don't need this constructor, so we can get rid of that as well. With those changes, we can close this file. And inside of account, we want to use our account repository. And we want to call the get method and pass in the username. And we will use the same logic. If result is not null, then that is going to be returned. Otherwise, we want to create a new object. But we don't want a new post object. We want a new account object. So let's change the name of that method. And we also need to change the object that is returned here. Now we still need ID, we need username, and we need password, but we don't need 2 passwords, we just need 1 password. And then we need the email. So let's delete everything that isn't a string. Let's change slug to email, and we can get rid of author ID and tags. Now, we might need a roles property, although no, we shouldn't, because we're not going to worry about assigning the roles to the user object itself. Anytime we want to retrieve the roles for a user, we need to hit the database. So with that, our account class should be completed. So let's go ahead and leave this open in case if we need to go back to it. And let's copy our tag.cs file, and let's paste it, and let's change this one to role.cs. And of course, we will go through the same modifications. We want to change the class name to role. Now, we do not want roles. Once again, there is another property called roles inside of a page class. So we want role, and we can get rid of the constructor here. And let's also change the comment. The page, the mode is all going to be the same. Now we don't have a friendly name here. All we have is a name. So let's just change it from friendly name to name. The logic is going to be the same. And instead of using the tag repository, we will use our role repository, passing in the name to retrieve that record. And if one exists, we will return that. Otherwise, we will create a new role object. This is going to be a very simple object. We have an ID and a name, and that is it. And so now let's go back to our account.cs HTML, and let's change some of this code. Now I commented out the lines where we retrieve the current post and the tags and all of that stuff. For right now, we just need to retrieve the account. So let's change this variable to account, and we want account.current. And we also want to retrieve all of the roles. So let's uncomment this line, and let's call this variable roles. We want to use our role repository, and we want to retrieve all of the roles inside of our database table. Now, we eventually want to retrieve all of the roles that are assigned to a particular user, and we will get to that later. And now let's change the values inside of the form. So for the account ID, we want to use account.id. For the username, we want account.name. We will get rid of .title. Now for the password, we don't really want to display any information here. First of all, because it's going to be encrypted, and we don't want to populate these fields with the encrypted value. But also, regardless of if we are creating a new user or if we are editing a user, we want this to be blank. Because if we are creating a new user, then, the password is going to be provided by whoever is filling out the information. If we are editing a user, then we want to keep it blank so that whenever the edit form is submitted, we can determine whether or not if the password needs to be changed. If these fields are blank and we are editing a user, then we know that we don't need to update the password field. Otherwise, we would want to do that. So we will leave the value as empty there. For the email, we want our account.email. We will get rid of .slug. And let's change this for each loop. For var role in roles, we want to display the role ID, and we also want the role name. Now we are still going to have to do something here with what we did for the selected attribute, but we will leave that code for now. If we try to run the code, we are going to get an exception, and that will just be a reminder that we need to address that. And for our grid, let's go ahead and let's make some modifications here. We want to use our accounts repository. We want to retrieve all of them, and we want to order by something other than date created. I guess a good metric would be the username itself. So order by username, and we will just let it default to ascending. Now we need to change the links here. We no longer want post. We want account/edit. And then account/delete. And we also want to specify the name property here, or rather the username property. Then we will change title to username. We really don't want to display the password in this table. Otherwise, that would be a security risk. So we will do the email. And for the header, we don't really need a header, but let's just do email address. Let's also add a header for the username column so that it will be 2 words as opposed to 1. So it will be username. And then we don't need the rest of these fields, so we can delete those. We also need to delete that comma, and then that will be our grid. So let's move on to the role form. I commented out this line 10. Let's uncomment that. Let's change the variable name to role, and we want to call the role.current property. We'll change tag ID to role ID. We'll do the same thing for the name property as well. And then for the grid, we want to use our role repository. Want to once again retrieve all of them. We will order them by name, and then we need to change the URL. We want role instead of tag, so we will make that modification. We also need to change the property on the item from URL friendly name to name, and then we can get rid of this other column. So all that we have is the name. So we really shouldn't need anything else inside of this role.cshtml. So I'm going to copy this line that has the create new role, and let's paste that inside of the account. Let's put it before the grid. And instead of creating a new role, we will of course create a new user. So create new user. Now let's turn our attention to getting the roles for a user. When it comes to getting user information, I'd like to have just a central location that I can go to get information about the currently logged in user or just any user in general. Like for example, I would have a class called web user or something similar, and it would have a static method like get roles for user. And then you could supply the user ID, which we have because we have the account. So we could say accounts.id, and then this would give us the roles. So let's say roles for user, and then we will call webuser.getRoles for user. So let's create this class. I'm going to do so inside of app code at the root of app code, and we want this method called getRoles for user. So public static, we want an IEnumerable of let's start with a string, and let's just get the names of our roles. We might want to change this to dynamic and have both the ID and the name. But for right now, we'll just stick with string. And get roles for user, int ID. Now, we need to get the roles for the user, but we have to hit our mapping table. So now we need to decide, okay, is this something that belongs inside of our account repository, or is it something that belongs inside of our role repository? Well, we are retrieving role information, even though that it is based upon a given user. So we want to use our role repository. So we could just do something like return role repository dot get roles for user, pass in the ID, and then that would give us what we want. Although in our case, let's say that this is going to return an IEnumerable of dynamic. So then we could say that we want to select just the names. So we would have a lambda expression with R and then our name. That would give us an IEnumerable of string, although we will more than likely have to cast this as a string. Okay, so let's go to our role repository and let's write this get roles for user method. So open up role repository, and I'm just going to add this at the end of the file. This is going to be public static IEnumerable of dynamic, and the name is get roles for user by ID. If we find that we need to specify a username later on, then we can do that. Now, we want to retrieve the role information, but we are also going to have to include our mapping table. So our SQL statement is going to be select all from roles, and let's use an alias of R. We want to inner join the user's roles map. We'll call this m on r.id equals m.roleID. And we want to make that selection based upon where m role ID equals to the supplied ID. So we want a parameter of @0. And actually that's incorrect. We don't want to select by role ID. We want to select by user ID. Okay, so the SQL statement should work. Now we just need to connect to our database with database.open, passing in the connection string. And then we should be able to just return db.query, passing SQL, and then ID for our parameters value. So this get roles for user should work, and the get roles for user method on our web user class should work. And we can get rid of this constructor because I don't think we will need it. And so inside of account, we can take these roles for user, and inside of our for each loop, we still want the role ID here, because whenever we are updating or inserting a new user and applying roles, that makes things easier to do so by ID. So we will have the ID there, and we no longer want these post tags. We want the roles for user. And we don't need to use the any method here because roles for user is an enumerable of string. We can simply use the contains method, and we can check to see if the role.name is going to work, although we need to cast that as a string probably. And I think everything should work. So I'm interested to see if this runs. So let's run it, and what do we have? Let's go to our create new user, and we have an exception. Let's see, we're getting an exception of get roles for user. That's not what I was hoping to get, so let's continue so that it'll continue on and crash. And let's see here. Okay, inside of get roles for user, I know that we are using the name property, but I'm not sure that that's the issue. So let's go to account, and actually, the stack trace would be very helpful. So let's run it again. Let's go to the create user, let's continue, and let's look at the stack trace. See, the exception is that the expanded object does not have a definition of name. Well, let's see, the last method that was called was callSite.target, and before that, ASP.PageAdminAccount. So I don't think it's with anything that we've written. I think it's with our CS.html file. So let's look at what we have here. We have account ID, account name. That's our problem. This should be username and not name. So let's run this again, and let's see if we have any issues. And no, our new form showed up. And that is great, although we're not seeing any roles here, but I don't think we created any roles. So let's jump over to the roles. So admin/role and then new, and that form is going to work fine. So next we need to write our handlers, which is going to handle the post requests for our account and for our role. Let's start for the role, because that way it will give us an easy way of testing to see if the roles will show up inside of our account page. So let's take the tag handler, let's copy that file and paste it, and then let's rename it to rolehandler.cs. Now we've been through this process before, so instead of boring you with the tedium of making minute changes to each individual method, I'm just going to paste in the code for our role handler. But let's go over it just so that you know what's going on. First of all, we retrieve the values of our form fields, the mode, the name, and the ID. We check the mode. If it's edit, then we edit, new, then we create, or delete, then we delete. And if we don't get an exception inside of these operations, we just redirect back to admin/role. Now, inside of the create method, we first of all try to find an existing role with this name, because if one exists, we don't want to add another one. And so if one does exist, then we throw an exception. Otherwise, we add the new role to the repository. For the edit method, we once again try to find a role with the given ID. If one doesn't exist, then we throw an exception because we cannot edit a role that doesn't exist. Otherwise, we edit that role. And then finally, the delete method. We're not doing any checking inside of this method because SQL Server really doesn't care if a record exists or not. It's going to execute the SQL statement, and if one exists, then it will be deleted. Otherwise, nothing will happen. So with this done, let's run our application and let's see if we can add, edit, and update or add, edit, and delete our roles. So let's go to admin/role, and we should see a list of nothing, which is great. So let's create a new role, and the first thing that we need is an administrator. So let's create that role. Let's make it lowercase. No, let's start with an uppercase A, and then let's click on submit, and we don't get any exceptions, and that's a wonderful thing. So let's then edit this. I don't want to have an uppercase A. I want a lowercase a because that just makes things a lot easier to check, at least as far as C# is concerned. So by changing that, let's click on submit, and the edit works as well. So now let's try to delete, and the delete will work as well. So everything as far as the roles is working. So let's re-add another role. Let's just call it admin for short, and that is going to give us our admin role. So now let's go to admin/account, and let's see if the role is going to display inside of our select box. So let's click on the create new user and we get an exception. Let's see, object does not contain a definition for contains. Well, that's rather interesting because we shouldn't have an object here. We called the contains method on an IEnumerable. So let's continue. Let's look at the stack trace just to see where this is occurring. It is occurring inside of the CS HTML file. So let's look there. Well, here's the roles for user, but that says that it is dynamic when I know that the method that returns the value for roles for user is specifically IEnumerable of string. So let's stop running our application and let's take a look at this code. So here, let's look at IntelliSense. It says that this is a dynamic expression. Well, that's interesting because it's not. If we look at the method, it is simply returning an IEnumerable of string. The only thing that I could think of is because we are using dynamic here, but I would think that because we are calling the select and then explicitly casting this as a string, that it would be fine. So let's play with this. Let's get rid of this cast here. Let's call the cast method. Let's specify string, and let's see if that changes anything as far as IntelliSense is concerned. No, it is still a dynamic expression. So let's play a little bit more. Let's just go ahead and call toArray. It's going to return a string array, and still dynamic expression. If we look at everything else, well, that's an IEnumerable of dynamic, and that is dynamic, but still, that's just really, really, really weird. So for one last thing, let's explicitly try to cast this as an IEnumerable of string inside of this method, and no. So that's really interesting. I don't know why we are getting the results that we are getting there. So we could probably do a cast here, but that's going to be rather ugly. I know that we did that with the tags, but I really don't want to do that if we don't have to in this case. If we look at roles for users now, then that is an IEnumerable of string. That's funny. Okay, so instead of doing that, we could just say that this is dynamic, and then that should work. Otherwise, because it was var, it was just automatically an object. But if we specify it as dynamic, then this should work. So let's run this once again, and let's click on create new user. Nope, we still get that problem. So we are going to have to cast it. There's really no way around that, and that is really a bummer because I really don't want to do that. Okay, so we have this explicit cast of IEnumerable of string, and we go back to the browser. Let's refresh this page, and it works. We have our form, and we have the roles inside of this select box. Well, it works, but that's really going to bug me. I'm going to have to find out why that is the case there. Unless if account.id. Let's do this. Let's do int. I'm sorry. I'm spending way too much time on this, but I want to find out why this does not work. So we have int here. Let's drop this, and let's see what we have. Now we have an IEnumerable of string. Woohoo! Okay, so I can live with this cast here. That's perfectly fine for me. Okay, so now that that crisis has been averted, we need to write the handler for our account. So let's start with our post handler, and let's just copy and paste it, and let's rename it to account.handler.cs. Now, once again, we've been through this process before, so I'm going to paste in the code for the account handler. But there are some very big changes between the post handler and the account handler. So we will need to go over this code. We will also need to modify our account repository. But first of all, let's look at the process request method. We retrieve all of the form fields, the mode, the username, the 2 passwords, the ID, the email, the roles, and then we split the role data and assign that to the roles variable as an IEnumerable of int. Now, the first mode that we check for is delete. And if it is delete, then we simply delete the user with the username. Now, the delete method is similar to the role handler's delete method. There's no checking involved. If the user's there, it's deleted. If not, then nothing happens. Now, the reason why I went with the delete mode first is because there are some things that we need to do for both the edit and the new modes. That is, we need to check to see if the passwords are correct or if they are equal to one another. If they aren't, then we throw an exception. We also check to see if the email value has an actual value. If it's blank, then we throw an exception. And ideally, we would check to see if it's an actual email. So we will need to add some real validation to these fields. Then we do the same thing for the username. If it's blank, we throw an exception. And if these checks pass, then we check to see if the mode is edit. If it is, then we call the edit method, passing in the ID, the username, the password, the email, and the roles. And then if it's new, then we create the new user with the username, the password, the email, and the roles. So let's look at the create method first. We first check to see if password is blank. If it is blank, then we throw an exception, because if we are creating a new user, a password has to be supplied. So if that check passes, then we check to see if there is a user with the desired username. If there is, then we throw an exception. Otherwise, we add the user to our repository. Now notice here that I'm calling crypto.hashpassword. Inside of the repository, we called this method so that it was automatically done for us whenever we added a user to the database. And really, we shouldn't be doing that inside of the repository. The repository, we should be able to just get information and then set the information. We shouldn't be doing anything with that information inside of the repository. So that's one change that we will need to make inside of the repository. The other is that we will need to take into account this other parameter, the roles. So this is going to look a lot like the post repository, where we have the add roles method and the delete roles. We will have, the add tags and delete tags. We will have the same thing for the roles. So that is the creation of a new user. For editing an existing user, we first of all get the user with the ID. If one doesn't exist, then we throw an exception. But then we need to determine if we are changing the password for the user or if we are leaving the password alone. So we have this updated password, and it is initialized with the existing password. And if the password that was entered into the form is not blank, then we want to use that as our new password. So then we set updated password to the encrypted password value, and then we pass that on to the edit method. Now notice that we are reusing the user's username here. We are not changing that. Later on, we might want to add that ability, but we would also have to check to see if an existing user was there with that username, and then throw an exception and all of that. But to make things simple, we are reusing the username. We are updating the password, either with the existing password or with a new password. And then we are also passing in the email and the roles. So we need to go to our account repository, and we need to make these modifications. So first of all, let's also open up the post repository, and let's find the add tags method and the delete tags method. And let's copy those. Let's paste them into our account repository, because the logic is going to be the same. We just need to modify the names of the fields and the tables. So we can close the post repository now. And in fact, let's go ahead and modify these. So instead of add tags, we want to add roles. Let's change post ID to user ID. And let's also change the tags parameter to roles. We still need our database object, and we will first check to see if there are any roles, and if not, we will simply return. Otherwise, we want to insert into the user's roles map table, and we want the values for the user ID column and the role ID column. And then we will change these variables, var role in roles. We will execute that SQL statement with the user ID and the role value. So the delete tags we will rename to delete roles. The statement is going to delete from users roles map, where the user ID is equal to the supplied value, and everything else should work there. Okay, so now let's go to the add method. So let's find the add method. We need to add another parameter, an IEnumerable of int for the roles. So let's call those roles. And let's first of all remove the call to crypto.hashPassword. But it looks like I already did that because we would have done that here whenever we executed this SQL statement. So you will need to remove that method call. And it seems I did that as well on the edit method. So that is a mistake on my part. But that's okay. Just make sure that you are not hashing the password inside of the repository. Okay, so for the add method, we first of all check to see if there is a user with a given username. If so, we throw an exception. Otherwise, we insert that new user. And after we insert that data, we want to retrieve that user once again. So let's copy this line of code where we are setting the user variable. We also want this SQL statement. So let's change the variable name to select SQL so that we can simply reuse that. And then we will call this other one just var SQL. So we are using the query single method with our select SQL and the username. This will give us our user that we can then call the add roles method. We can pass in the ID. We want to pass in the roles and then the database connection object. And that should be all that we need to do for the add method. So let's go to the edit method. After we update the user, we then want to delete the roles. So we will call delete roles, passing in the user ID and then the database object. And then we want to add the new roles. So we will pass in ID and then roles and then DB for the database object. And that should be all that we need to do, although we are getting a red squiggly because we need to add an IEnumerable of int called roles as a parameter here. Let me put these on 2 lines there. So with these changes, we should be ready to go. So let's run this and let's go to our account page. Although no, we get a build error. Cannot use local variable SQL before it is declared. We need to change that first usage to select SQL. So let's run this once again. And we want to go to admin/account. And we will create a new user. Let's create an administrator or an admin. Yeah, let's call it admin. For the password, let's just do password. And then for the email address, I'm just going to put in an email address. And let's select the admin role. So let's click on submit and hopefully everything will work. It did. Wow, I'm kind of surprised. Let's look at the actual data inside of SQL Server. Let's make sure that our password was hashed. So let's go down to the users table. Let's select the top rows and our password was hashed. The username is admin and the email is what I specified. Let's look at the mapping for the roles. And we have the mapping, the user ID of 1 and the role ID of 2. So we have everything set up as far as user management is concerned. Now we need to add the ability to let users log in. And we will tackle that, among other things, in the next lesson.